Do we have to die to live? Oh yeah. 1,000 deaths. Because imagine.
And people are buying your books.
I know, but you know what? Yeah, because rebirth, right? And I'm not talking just in a Christian metaphor here. I don't care if you're agnostic or Muslim or Jewish. Rebirth. There has to be, we have to bury things and we have to grieve them, and they have to go away for good. That's death. And then something new is born of it. But yeah, absolutely.
Except the revolution can come through death to get the rebirth. But
No, yeah. And let me tell you, rebirth's not easy. And death is not easy.
But what does forgiveness have to do with resurrection or rebirth?
You know, when I was writing The Gifts of Imperfection, I thought forgiveness would be one of the 10 guideposts for the gifts because it's such a huge issue. And I had already turned in the draft of it. And then I was doing some interviews around forgiveness just to make sure, because it's such a big thing, a big topic, and it's so hard and it's so tender. And those interviews that I did blew my idea of what forgiveness was out of the water. It didn't fit at all with what I had put forward. So I pulled it back. And I've been working for a decade trying to figure out forgiveness, but I could never, you know, as a qualitative researcher, we look for saturation, meaning we keep getting the same answers over and over as we interview people to the point where we believe that it's a valid and reliable answer, and that it's broad enough to capture everyone's experiences. And so I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to solve forgiveness. And then one day I was
You woke up one day trying to solve forgiveness?
I spent a decade trying to solve it. But
one day,
it's a lot of mornings, but one day I did solve it. I was at church and I was listening to Joe Reynolds, who is an Episcopal priest, telling stories about forgiveness and his experience doing pastoral counseling. And he said, in order for forgiveness to happen, something has to die. And I was like, I literally put my hand over my face. I was like, oh my God, the one concept or construct that I had left out it was the reason why forgiveness was never whole in my work was grief. The reason why forgiveness is so hard is because in order for us to forgive, something has to die and we have to grieve something. And so I went back into the data, had a couple of doctoral students with me, and we started looking, and it was the grief all through. It was the grief. It was, you know, he was telling the story about a couple where the guy had an affair. And they knew that one of them wanted the marriage to end, but he couldn't let go of the shame, and she couldn't let him let go of the shame, and she couldn't let go of the rage. And, you know, Joe just said, you're going to have to bury and kill off this marriage as you know it today, and grieve the loss of what this was in order for something new to be born. It's not ever going to be the same again. And I have goosebumps telling it. And when I went back, and even if it's forgiveness of someone you care about says something really hurtful about you, you have to bury the idea that that person doesn't have the capacity to hurt you, or that wouldn't hurt you. And then something new has to be born. And maybe it's deeper and richer and more beautiful, or maybe it's not going to be born. And maybe there's just a death and a loss. But the people who've truly forgiven, and then what was crazy, I don't even write about this in the book, but what was crazy is the Tutus, Archbishop Tutu and Reverend Tutu, his daughter, sent me an early copy of their book on forgiveness. And I'm reading it on a plane, and they sent it to me, I think, because they quote some of my work about shame. But as I'm reading it, I'm like, oh my God. They don't say something has to die, but they talk about the grief that's inherently important in forgiveness. And they talk about the truth and reconciliation in South Africa, and they talk about what they've seen around forgiveness, and it just fit. I mean, I make the recommendation of their book in Rising Strong and say it's one of the most important books I've read in my life. But grief is an inherent part of forgiveness. Sometimes we just have to kill off and bury being right, and the power that comes from being, and the juice that we get from being right in order for forgiveness to happen. Which means the willingness to kill something off or bury something and grieve it makes being forgiven the ultimate act of love, right? Yeah, so it's powerful.
That's the center of the universe stuff right there, sister. That's